Hello everyone, I think I've got a pretty good video for you today. We're doing our first submitted question. Thaddeus McMonster writes, "Great videos!" Thank you. I would love to see one on the origin of the term boss as the enemy at the end of a level. It's an interesting question, so let's get started. It probably goes without saying, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, we're talking about the powerful monsters that usually appear at the end of levels. Generally speaking, they're significantly harder than other enemies, with more health and stronger attacks. They're usually unavoidable and must be defeated to progress the game. Thaddeus asked about the origin of the term, but to do that, I think we also need to get into the origin of the concept. Luckily for us, the first video game boss is well documented, and it's older than you might think. In 1974, Gary Whisenhut and Ray Wood created a dungeon-crawling RPG called The Game of Dungeons. It was loosely based on Dungeons & Dragons and inspired by an earlier dungeon exploring game called Petit 5. The game would soon become more widely known by the letters D&D. The creation of this game is actually really interesting, and I encourage everyone to read up on it, but we've got a lot to get through, so I'm going to just stick to the boss stuff. So in the 70s, very few games had any sort of real ending. Everything would just loop endlessly, and the goal was just to survive as long as possible and to get a high score. D&D was the same, but one of Gary and Ray's biggest frustrations with similar games was always having to restart the next time they wanted to play. So they added a save game feature to D&D. But this led to a new gameplay problem. The ability to save and reload a game made the high score somewhat meaningless. So they decided they needed a different objective. The game changed so that the players had to get to the end of the dungeon, grab a magical orb, and get back out. They realized that getting the orb needed some sort of final challenge, so inspired by the iconic cover to the Dungeons & Dragons rulebook, they put in a golden dragon to guard it. This was the first video game boss. Space shooters were the next place that we saw boss-type enemies. Games like 1980's Destroyer and Phoenix had more difficult enemies that would show up to challenge the player. They're a little different from what we think of today as game bosses, as these games tended to loop, so the player would end up fighting the same boss over and over and over again. 1980's Sasuke vs. Commander was a big step up for bosses. Mechanically, it was similar to other arcade space shooters, but it was themed around ninjas. The player had to fend off waves of shuriken-tossing ninjas until they could reach the boss. The various ninja masters each had their own special ninja techniques, such as using decoys, shape-shifting, and shooting waves of magical fire. It was here that we start to see the concept of levels each having a different boss, where each of them had their own unique challenge. Around this time, we also started seeing games like Donkey Kong or Sinistar that were named after the main antagonist. Bosses were getting more character and recognition over their faceless henchmen. Kung Fu Masters, released in 1984, continued this trend. The player had to fight through waves of regular bad guys to reach a more challenging boss. Again, each boss had their own unique strengths and fighting style, and had to be defeated before the player could proceed to the next floor. From this point on, the idea of a boss was well established, and within a few years, it would be a standard practice to have one at the end of a level or stage. Tracking down why we use the word boss specifically, and when we started doing it, is significantly tougher. Today the word is so recognized in gaming that most dictionaries actually include the gaming meaning among their definitions of the word. For example, Merriam-Webster has a definition: a major antagonist in a game, such as a video game or board game, and usually one that must be overcome in order for the player to progress. Language evolves over time, so there's likely not an exact time and place that everyone suddenly decided to start doing it. I try to think back to the first time I heard it, and honestly I'm really not sure. I think it was probably linked to the past. I feel like we were calling the guys at the end of levels bosses, even though the manual refers to them as dungeon masters. So let's start with the word itself. In English, the word boss comes from the Dutch word baas. It was introduced to America in the 17th century by Dutch settlers. It roughly translated to something more like master, but could be used in English without the connotations of ownership and slavery. so it was a useful word to describe someone in a position of authority. Now we can get into how the Industrial Revolution and the rise of factories led to an increased need for a word that put a person in authority over, but not ownership of, a subordinate, but we're already getting a bit into the weeds here. So why boss? Why not leader, master, head honcho, the big cheese? Well, if you go back far enough, we actually do. There's a pretty long period where there's no real consistent naming scheme for boss-like characters. Even the different versions of Kung Fu Masters name them differently. One version calls them the 5 Biggies, another uses Gang Masters, and the NES port actually does use boss. Most sources I came across agree that the general idea of using boss probably comes from organized crime. The idea of a mob boss translates pretty well to the head of a group of villains. I've seen a few people point to the 1971 Bruce Lee movie, The Big Boss, known as Fists of Fury in North America, where a lone hero battles his way through an army of goons to challenge the head of a drug smuggling operation. The film The Godfather was released a year later, further cementing the idea of criminals operating in a hierarchy and taking orders from a boss. But when did we start using it in games? When tracking the use of the term, we need to think about how words and ideas spread. Today, a lot of gaming terms are community-driven. Words spread as players use them in online discussions or while playing multiplayer games. An influential streamer can coin a new word and have tons of people using it practically overnight. But in the long ago dark ages before the internet, gaming communities were much more localized. You discuss a game with people in your local arcade or other kids in your school, but you probably weren't picking up words a bunch of players on the other side of the country started using.
Mortal Kombat on Sega Genesis is the best video game ever.
I disagree. It's a very good game, but I think Donkey Kong is the best game ever.
Donkey Kong sucks.
You know something? You suck.
Instead, we're going to be looking at published media. Before the internet, most of our game jargon is going to be coming from books, magazines, and the games themselves. A few sources I came across tried to peg an approximate date when magazines started using boss more often. For example, this Kotaku podcast episode mentions a Nintendo Power's use of the word. There's a little confusion here for me because the transcription of the episode says 1988, but it really sounds like he's saying 1998 to me.
It really started showing up in Nintendo Power in 1998?
I came across a few other sources that pointed to Nintendo Power as a source of boss becoming more popular, so I went through back issues of Nintendo Power to see how they use it, and the results were interesting. In the very first issue, in 1988, they mention a little boss when talking about Birdo in Mario 2. After that, the use of boss is very inconsistent. They might go 3 issues in a row without using it once, then use it 10 times in the next. At first I was confused by this, until I started looking at the manuals for these games. For example, in their guide to the NES game Fester's Quest, Nintendo Power uses the word boss many times. But the manual for that game refers to these enemies as alien bosses. I'm not sure if it was an actual policy, but it seems like Nintendo Power tended to defer to the language used by the game designers. If a game called a character a boss, so did Nintendo. If they used leader, guardian, or some other title, then that was used here as well. A lot of the time they just referred to a boss character directly by name. So I think we can look at Nintendo Power as evidence of when the word was gaining popularity, but not necessarily that it was this magazine driving the change. Before Nintendo Power started in 1988, there was a much smaller publication called the Nintendo Fun Club. It was mostly tips and tricks for popular Nintendo titles and previews for upcoming games. I was able to find a few mentions of the word boss when discussing Double Dragon and Kid Icarus. I've also seen a few references to Joystick magazine beginning to use the term in 1983. I couldn't get my hands on every 1983 issue, but I found a lot of them, and I only saw a single use when referring to an enemy in the game Galaga. But more on that later. To get a wider view, I took a look at Google's Engram Viewer. If you're not familiar, it's a tool that takes a look at published works and scans it to see how often the word is used over a given time period. So for example, I can see the word boss, regardless of context, picks up use in the 1800s and holds steady until the mid-1990s when it suddenly becomes much more common. Getting a good look at its use in gaming context is tricky. Boss is a pretty common word. Trying to limit it to works that also mention gaming in some way gave inconsistent results. There's a lot of software magazines that mention video games, but also office software, so the mention of a boss in an article about word processors and gaming somewhere else will count the same as mention of a video game boss. I also ran into a lot of trade magazines that let people order electronics, including both video games and other equipment, with the word boss in either the company name or the product name. I tried looking for references to the terms mini-boss, boss fight, final boss, which I think are more strongly tied to gaming. You can see that mini-boss sees a hump from 83 to 88 and drops in popularity. Final boss picks up in 87 and only gets more popular. But it's kind of hard to draw a lot of solid conclusions just from this. While poking around old magazines, I came across the curious case of Bayou Billy, an NES game released in 1988. The enemies are a gang of organized criminals and smugglers. Nintendo Power refers to the head of the bad guys as Boss Gordon, but the manual refers to him as Godfather Gordon. Also, props to whoever came up with the names for bad guys like Lightning Rod, Mardi Gras, and Schwartz and Egger. Now, this seems to support the idea of boss being a reference to a mob boss. It's one of the only examples I could find of Nintendo Power breaking from the labels used by the game. Possibly they wanted to distance themselves from a more violent-sounding title, or they thought that children might not be familiar with the term. On a whim, I checked the Japanese manual, which also refers to him as Bossu Gordon. This is when I realized I was missing a big piece of the puzzle: the influence of Japanese on gaming lingo. A lot of these game manuals that were driving the word choices of the magazines were written in Japanese first, then translated to English. So the use of a particular Japanese term could actually be driving what words are chosen in English translations. Interestingly, that word seems to be boss, or bossu, an adaptation of the English word that's actually been present in Japanese for quite a while. Remember before when I said that the English word boss came from Dutch settlers in the 17th century? Boss as a loan word was actually introduced to Japan around the same time by Dutch traders and merchants. It didn't take off nearly as quickly as it did in the States. Japanese already has a complex system of titles for various types of relationships and status levels, and was generally not as quick to adapt foreign words as English was. I'd like to pause here for a moment and just mention that I did live in Japan for a few years, but I am far from an expert in either the Japanese language or Japanese culture. So take this next bit with a grain of salt, and I would very much welcome comments from any native speakers if I'm wrong on anything here. I found a few sources that suggest boss might have picked up some use among the actual Yakuza in the 1920s and 30s who were seeing it in gangster movies that were popular at the time. But the post-war era of the 1950s is when Japan really started to get a lot of American media. Hollywood in the United States was booming, while Japan's own media production was still recovering from World War II. This led to an increase of English words being adapted for regular Japanese use. It looks like boss started to see some informal use during the 60s and 70s. It's hard to nail down the specifics, but it seems like around this time, boss took on a bit of an uncouth, sarcastic meaning. You wouldn't call your manager or the CEO boss. There are formal titles in Japanese that'd be much more appropriate, but you might use it with a supervisor you're on friendly terms with, especially if you're out of the office. The earliest game reference I could find in a Japanese game using the word bossu was Galaga in 1981. There was an enemy referred to as the Boss Galaga, or sometimes the Galag Boss. He took 2 hits, and he had the ability to capture your ships with a tractor beam. You might have seen his cameo in Smash Bros. Interestingly, while English gamers now also call him the Boss Galaga, it appears that this was initially a Japanese name, as English arcade operator manuals refer to this character as a command ship. Similar space shooters, such as 1985's Twin Bee, occasionally followed this trend, but it wasn't an overnight change. As more games and more game genres included boss-type enemies, the word became more common. It's hard to tell how solid this is, but generally I see an increase in Japanese game manuals using bossu, which is usually translated as boss in English. From my limited reading, when the languages in English and Japanese manuals didn't match up, it was much more common for the Japanese source to use boss than the English one. Let's go over a few highlights. In 1986, the manual for Metroid in both languages refers to mini-bosses. This implies that by this point, the concept of a regular boss was generally understood. The same year, Kid Icarus bosses are called bosses in Japanese, but gatekeepers in English. In 1987, the Japanese game Metal Gear literally names their final boss Big Boss, a decision that would be translated faithfully into English. In 1988, Mario 3 has characters which are called Fortress Bosses in Japanese, but Guardians in English. Interestingly, both games refer to this giant fish as a boss bass. The last real source I tried looking at was game hint books. Before YouTube walkthroughs, we had game FAQs, and before that, we had physical books. They took off in the early 90s, and they are positively full of the word boss. I have a theory that these books, where the author has to explain a large variety of games, may have helped standardize the term boss. Also, one thing I was not aware of until now was that in the 80s, you could actually order VHS tapes to help you with your games.
This Game Player Strategy tape is full of hints, tips, and playing strategies. To get the most from this tape, we suggest you first read the manual that comes with the cartridge, and also have some experience playing the game. Are you ready? Let's go! In these early scenes, punching is best.
In the end, there's no obvious smoking gun. No one game suddenly used boss and changed everything. But as a rough breakdown, mob movies got big in the 70s when The Godfather came out, getting people used to the idea of a mob boss or a crime boss, both in English and Japanese. In 1981, Galaga uses the term boss for one of their stronger enemies. Throughout the rest of the 80s, the term is used increasingly often in game manuals as well as books and magazines, and by the mid-90s, it looks like it was pretty much the standard term. But what do you think? Do you remember when and where you first heard the word being used like this? Do you think there's something that I missed? Thank you once again to Thaddeus McMonster for this question, and all of you for watching this video. And if you've got your own question or topic you'd like me to explore, please let me know in the comments. See you next time.